I'm ready whenever.
I'm ready.
Right, shall I start?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Everyone. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in our the second day, session 3 of the ERF webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on households and firms in the MENA region. Our third session will have 2 papers. The first you already see shared on the screen on distressed firms in time of COVID-19, the case of MENA, the small and medium enterprises. It has 2 co-authors, Dr. Zuhair El-Sahli and Muayyad El-Samara, and our presenter today is Dr. Zuhair El-Sahli, who is an academic and researcher at Qatar University College of Business and Economics. He holds a PhD in economics and econometrics from the University of Nottingham, and his research interests lie in the areas of international economics, macroeconomics, and applied econometrics. His research is published in top peer-reviewed academic journals in economics, such as the Journal of International Economics and the Canadian Journal of Economics. And of course, I am Mona Saeed, Professor of Economics at AUC and proud fellow of the ERF from its inception. And I'm very pleased to be presenting this first paper by Dr. Zuhair, who has 15 minutes. And without further ado, Dr. Zuhair, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much for arranging this webinar. So yeah, I'll go ahead with the research. So as the title says, we are interested in the effects of COVID-19 on firms, mainly small and middle-sized enterprises in the MENA region. We are interested in how COVID-19 affected firms, smaller firms in the MENA region. As you may already know, the SMEs are extremely important for economies in the MENA region, and they form, you can make the claim that they form the backbone of many economies in the region. And we also know that COVID-19 was extremely challenging to both individuals and firms. And SMEs are especially vulnerable to this shock, given their size and their limited resources, and hence the need to understand how this pandemic affected these firms. So what are the exact research questions that we ask? We want to understand the effects of the pandemic on the labor force and operations of these SMEs. We want to understand how they adapt to the crisis, and we want to also see how these firms can be supported going forward. Of course, this paper uses the data that was, of course, as you know, that was the center point of this whole project. So the MENA, the COVID-19 MENA, which was compiled by ERF with AFD as their sponsor. In this database, or in this survey, approximately 500 SMEs were surveyed from each of Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia. The survey is longitudinal in nature, in the sense that it takes a snapshot of the firm before the pandemic started in February 2020, and follows those firms for 3 consecutive periods, but we focus on 2 consecutive periods in this research, which are February and June 2021. Basically, what the data allows us to do is to compare the firm outcomes after the pandemic has hit those countries to pre-pandemic outcomes. And we try to draw a picture and a story of these firms during the pandemic. That we make use of, namely, we can look at how these results, how the effects of the COVID-19 differ by country, by sector, and by the size of SME. Also, since we have information on important factors such as remote work, government assistance, and international trade, we're able to use a difference in difference approach in order to study the differential outcomes of the firms to these different factors that are important to the shock. I'm going to jump directly to the results. I'm not going to show you any tables because in this webinar, we were asked to focus on policy implications. So I'll just jump to results and then highlight some of the policy recommendations. So what we find that firms and SMEs in the MENA regions and the fourth in the pandemic, what we find is that they more likely resort to wage reductions and hours of work reductions in the wake of the pandemic. But there's also a clear since we have data from Q1 and Q2 2021, we find some recovery that's going to be consistent throughout the results actually. So recovery in Q2 versus Q1 2021. The industry, in terms of the workforce, the industry that shrunk the most, or that was most affected, was the accommodation, and this is actually also consistent for other outcomes. If you could please mute your mic, because it's okay. Can we please?
Dr. Reem, can you please mute your mic?
Okay, I should do that. Okay. And we find that the largest firms recover the most in Q2 2021, and this is again a recurring a theme that we find in the data. If we move to other outcomes, likelihood that the firm closes during the pandemic, we find on average that around 7 to 9% of MENA SMEs in the sample closed their businesses temporarily at any time during the pandemic. In terms of adaptation, the majority of firms choose to adapt their business models in the aftermath of the crisis, mostly by switching to the internet and social media to reach their suppliers and clientele. In terms of sales and investments, SMEs expect on average a drop in sales of 1/3 in wave 1 and 17% in wave 2 of the survey compared to 2019 levels, suggesting again some improvement in sales in Q2 2021. So again, this recovery comes back in Q2 21. However, there's plenty of heterogeneity in all outcomes that I'm going to highlight now. So, for example, we keep this is something that comes up again and again in the data. We see that larger firms were less. So larger firms within SMEs. What do we mean by larger firms? We mean that those firms that have more than 50 employees, as firms that have up to 200 in this survey, up to 200 employees. So the larger firms, the ones that have more than 50 or more employees, they tend to be less affected by the pandemic, of course, and to be more resilient, and they adapt more, and they recover also faster. In terms of industry, we consistently find that the food and accommodation industry, so meaning the tourism industry, was affected the most across almost all outcomes, and they recover the least as well. And this is, of course, highlights the importance of physical presence and face-to-face interaction in this sector. Also, agriculture and fishing and mining was second in that regard. In terms of countries, Tunisian firms were least impacted in the first wave of the survey across all outcomes. However, countries tend to converge in the second wave because some countries recovered faster. And for example, Tunisian and Moroccan firms were less likely to close. Egyptian firms were most likely to adapt. And Moroccan and Egyptian firms have the best recovery in sales and investment in Q2 2021. Finally, in terms, I mentioned this during the introduction. I said that we have information on the firms that chose or were able to switch to remote mode. We have information on government assistance programs or participation in government assistance programs, and we have information on whether the firm participates in international trade. So we use this information in order to that have these features and compare them to firms that don't have these features. What we find is that remote work safeguards firms against closures. So this shows that they are more resilient. So remote work improves resilience in that sense. Also, firms that switched to remote work were significantly more likely to adapt their business model. With respect to government assistance, we do not find any evidence that participation in such programs improves firm outcomes. And finally, we do find strong evidence that importing and exporting strongly improves firm outcomes across the board in both waves. Now, if I were to jump to the policy implications, since I just highlighted that larger firms, even within SMEs, I mean, we know from the literature that larger firms tend to be more resourceful, they're more productive, they're more resilient. But we find that, interestingly, even within SMEs, this thing comes up again, where larger firms within SMEs are more resilient. So this suggests that the smallest of SMEs may require special attention. They may require special programs, government assistance programs that cater specifically to them in order to help them through the pandemic, through the crisis. Governments need to communicate their assistance programs more effectively, and this comes out from the survey, because what we find is that when asked whether firms choose to participate in government assistance programs, many firms mentioned that they're not aware of these programs, so suggesting that the communication of such programs was not done efficiently. Since firms resorted to wage and work hours reductions, salary subsidies and furlough schemes may be more appropriate as a sort of government assistance program. Export promotion programs and lower barriers to trade could serve as a way to improve firm resilience and adaptability in the face of disruptions during this pandemic and for future shocks. And finally, advances in IT have allowed for remote work, which highlights the importance of internet access for SMEs, and therefore subsidizing and lowering the cost of internet access, as well as improving internet quality, may be something that should be looked at as well. So that's all from my side.
Thank you very much for keeping time, or even even before the allocated time. I really appreciate that. I think it's best if we move to our second paper and our discussing comments before we open the floor for questions. But please feel free to put your questions while they're still fresh in your mind on this paper, on the Q&A or the chat, and they will be addressed in due course. Our second paper is about the impact of COVID-19 on households and firms in the MENA region, the case of Sudan, and our presenter is Professor Dr. Samia Sati Muhammad Noor. She's a full professor of economics and head of the Department of Economics, Khartoum University. She was visiting professor of the Economics and Research Fellow at the Center CSAE, Department of Economics, Oxford University, UK, during the pandemic, January to July 2022, at the beginning of the pandemic. This is one of her recent affiliations. She's also an affiliated researcher with Maastricht University, Netherlands, and of course, like many of us, is an affiliated research fellow with ERF. She is sharing her presentation now, and you can see from the title, it is, I think, it is about the impact of COVID on household and firms in the MENA region, the case of Sudan. I'm not sure if she'll be sharing a presentation, but that's the title in front of you now. Professor Samia, please go ahead and with your presentation.
Hello.
Hi.
Good afternoon.
You might want to just move the laptop camera a little bit down so we can see you properly.
Okay.
Move the camera a little bit down. Yes.
Yes, I'm pleased to present to you this paper about the impact of COVID on household and firm in MENA country, the case of Sudan. The outline of this presentation, first, I will show the aim of the research. Second, I will show some stylized facts on the incidence of COVID-19 in Sudan. I also will show briefly the relevance and contribution of the research. And then I will shortly also explain the research methodology. And after that, I will explain briefly the main result of the research. Finally, I will present the conclusion and policy recommendation. The aim of this research is to explain the status of household and firm during the COVID-19 pandemic in Sudan as a case study of the MENA country. In particular, this research aimed to explain the status of household income, labor market status, working condition, employment, unemployment. I would like to explain all of this defined by gender. I choose to explain this by gender because of availability of information. The second aim of this research is to investigate the status of micro, small, and medium size, mainly to explain the current status of work and business operation defined by firm characteristic, mainly defined by firm size according to the size of labor employed in each establishment. After that, I will also explain policy measures to manage the impact of COVID in Sudan. First, starting with some stylized fact or background on the incidence of COVID-19 in Sudan, we realized that during the last 2 years, Sudan has experienced a fast increase the incidence and rapid spread of COVID in Sudan in terms of both the number of cases and the number of deaths. For example, these two figures explain the rapid spread over the past 2 years. So this is explain that how it is very dangerous and how it is very risky for health in Sudan. Regarding the relevance and contribution of the research, I think this paper is very important and it provides a comprehensive and in-depth investigation of the status of household and firm during the COVID pandemic in Sudan as a case study of MENA region. Also, this paper provides important contribution because it fills the gap in the literature, mainly by discussing the status during the COVID pandemic, the status of both household and firm. So this provides very important contribution because this is provide new contribution or add to the literature in the MENA country. Also, the importance and relevance of this research is that it uses new primary data obtained from both the first round of the World Bank, the first draft of the paper. I have worked using the World Bank data because the Economic Research Forum data was not prepared yet. So I made the preliminary result using the World Bank. Then after the survey of the Economic Research Forum has been finished and the data are ready, I tried to revise the draft, and I used first and second wave of the Economic Research Forum data, and that was very useful for the discussion of making comparative analysis between the case of Sudan and other MENA countries, including Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia, because the survey includes the same data. So this provide a consistent result for making a comparison or comparative analysis for the impact of COVID on household and firm across MENA countries. So I think this is very important and very rich project because it provides important contribution even to the international literature. I think also this research is also, my paper is also since I use the same survey data, it enabled me to compare my result with other study in the literature, in the MENA literature. Mainly, my studies also provide contribution and provide results consistent with the study in the MENA literature. Also, from policy perspective, I think this paper is very important because it provides policy recommendation for policymakers to manage the economic and social impact on household and firm in Sudan. Regarding the research methodology, this paper uses recent secondary data over the past 20 years just to make explanation for our background about Sudan economy and the current political and economic crisis in Sudan. Also, I use both the descriptive and comparative approach, and I use primary data obtained from the Economic Research Forum COVID MENA Montal Household Sudan survey for both round April and August. So I use this data in order to explain or to assess the status of household during the COVID pandemic in Sudan, and also to explain the status of firm. So this provides very important contribution at the micro level, explaining both the current status or the status of household and firm during the crisis. Finally, also it provides insight to manage the impact of COVID at the micro level. Regarding the main result of the research, I realized that during the COVID pandemic, Sudan not only suffered from the COVID pandemic, but also simultaneously suffered from critical economic crisis caused by economic instability and political instability that started even before the COVID pandemic. This implies that it is very hard to separate the impact of the COVID pandemic and the impact of the critical economic crisis that started even before the COVID pandemic. So we make the analysis, but it is hard to separate the impact, the direct impact of COVID, because the other impact of economic instability and political instability interact with the problem regarding the COVID pandemic. The main result of the research, we realized that during the COVID pandemic period in Sudan, workers have suffered change in employment status, mainly change in main job and change in sector of employment and economic activity. In addition, also workers have experienced change in working condition, particularly change in number of working hours and change in household monthly wage and income. In addition, also workers have suffered from day off and suspension, or also delay in wage payment, and sometimes some of workers have suffered from reduced earning or delay in payment. Other workers also suffered from change in seasonal net monthly wage, and some workers also suffer from limited provision of social protection and social insurance. So this implies that the COVID pandemic has touched worker or labor market in Sudan through this effect. On the other hand, at the firm level or enterprise level, business establishments also have suffered from either temporary or permanent close of business due to COVID factor related to COVID pandemic, or sometimes reduction in business hours. So this also implies that COVID have affected firm in Sudan, and this is also has some implication as we will explain below. For example, between April 2021 and August. Yes,
please,
okay.
Dr. Samia, we don't see your slides.
Okay. Between April and August, employment rate decreased for some sector, agriculture.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to clarify that Dr. Samia is not sharing slides. This is just a cover page. She said she was not sharing slides. Okay. Please carry on, Dr. Samia.
I'm sharing the slides of Dr. Samia. Can you see the screen?
We can see
It's
only
not moving.
it's not moving. Okay.
Okay. Let me reshare the screen.
Yes, I'm trying to connect. Yes. So between April and August.
Can you see my screen now? Or
yes.
Is it moving or not?
Yes, that's good. Yes.
Yes, I can see. Yes, thank you. Yes, between April and August, we realize change in employment for some sector, for example, agricultural sector and health sector, and also change in unemployment because unemployment increase using standard definition. Unemployment increase for manufacturing sector, transport, and health sector and accommodation sector. Also, in unemployment rate increase using the broad definition. Unemployment increase for agricultural sector, for manufacturing sector, for accommodation and food services sector, and also for health sector. So this implies that some sector have been affected more by the crisis. In addition to change in employment and unemployment, also personal net monthly wage have also decreased for worker in some sector, including, for example, agriculture, manufacturing, construction, retail, transport and storage, and other services sector. So this implies that during the crisis, or at least during for the data that has been collected between April and August, this data reveal the impact of COVID on some sector have been affected more by COVID pandemic than other sector. Also, in terms of also change in number of hours have been also affected. For example, this graph shows the impact of COVID or the labor market status during the COVID in terms of labor market, in terms of employment and unemployment, and for those who are in the labor force or out of the labor force. Also, labor force participation rate have been also, we explain the differences between April and August, or the change during both period, using also the standard and broad definition of labor force participation rate. In addition, also employment, we realize some change in number of employment between April and August. And this is slide 12, slide 13. We see also change in job formality. We realize increase in the share of informal sector for both male and female, and for the total. And for female, also female have been affected more. This means that more female have been working in informal sector during the COVID pandemic. Also, employment stability has been also affected during the COVID pandemic. We see that the employment stability increase for male and female, and for the total also. In terms of social insurance, we realize a reduction in social insurance or social protection for both male and female. And again, we see that female have been affected more because the social insurance or social protection for female are less than male. Or the reduction in terms of social insurance has been more realized for female than for male. Also, we realize change in number of working hours between April and August. In addition, also, we see also change in the number of workers who have been working from home because of lockdown measure. We see that more workers have been encouraged to work from home, and we realize that for both male and female, the number of workers or the share of who are working from home increase, and we realize that female started to work more in home than male. In addition, also in terms of those who are attached to job, we realize also change in the number of or the share of those who are working. We realize that the reason for household didn't work, many reasons, including the lockdown or the closing of business or closing of workplace, in addition to another reason. So this is also implies the impact of COVID on labor market. The reason that household not able to do more work from home many reasons, including the lack of internet connection or internet infrastructure. Here also we see the change in main job for both male and female. We see how the COVID pandemic have changed the main job for both sex. Here we see also the impact of COVID in terms of layoff, suspension of worker for both sex, permanent or temporary layoff, and also delay in wage payment. Also, we see the impact in terms of a change in personal net monthly wage in the past months for both April and August. Here in slide 26, we see the change in employment defined by initial sector of employment. We see how the COVID pandemic have affected different sectors. For example, we explain that agriculture, for example, the employment decrease in agricultural sector and health sector compared to other sector. Here also we see in the increase in unemployment using the standard definition. For example, manufacturing sector and other sector also reveal decline, the increase in unemployment. Here also using the broad definition, we see some sectors have been affected more by the COVID pandemic. Here also the number of working hours, we see the differences across different sectors. In terms of also personal monthly wage, we see some workers in some sector have been suffer more in terms of reduction of personal monthly wage. Now moving to the status of firm, we see that some firm have been or some establishment has suffered from temporary or permanent close of business due to lockdown measure or even reduction of some number of working hours. Also, the business faced some difficulties or challenge during the COVID pandemic. These figures in slide 33 also explain how business suffered from some challenge during the lockdown measure. Now, based on the above result, some business suggested some policy or from the business perspective or fair or business establishment perspective, the most needed policy to support business over the COVID crisis. We see the most needed policy differ according to gender and also according to time period between April and August. For example, in April, some preferred some policy measure, and in August, some preferred other measure. Anyway, this is explained from firm perspective or business enterprise perspective, how the government can support business establishment to overcome the COVID pandemic period. Now coming to the conclusion and policy recommendation, the result of this paper provide very important contribution, and some of the results are consistent with the result in the MENA literature and labor market in the MENA country. This paper also provide important contribution and explain change in employment, unemployment, wage, and hour defined by occupation and also defined by initial sector of economic activity. Based on the result of the paper, the major policy recommendation, we recommend increased government support to manage the COVID pandemic period and the impact on labor market. We recommend supporting social protection for workers across all firms and all sectors. Also, we recommend provision of social insurance for workers across all firms and all sectors. In addition, we also recommend introducing measures to support the demand for labor, increase the demand for labor through the provision of new employment incentive, mainly by provision of hiring subsidy to some establishment, and also by improving access to formal and regular job in all sectors. In addition, also we recommend increasing government direct support by increasing monthly wage subsidy to support all workers, especially poor workers in all sectors. We also recommend increasing government support to firm and business enterprises by, for example, provision of business loan, provision of salary subsidy, and also reducing tax, and also provision of a specific product input or services for firm and business enterprises. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Sati. I think in the interest of time, we should go straight to the discussion comments by Professor Reem Miloui. She's a full professor of economics and statistics at the University of Manouba, Tunis. She has a PhD in economics from University of Bourgogne, France. She published many academic articles in very selective international journals. She's a consultant with the Tunisian Institute of Strategic Studies, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the African Bank of Development, the ILO, and others. Her main area of expertise are on firms' productivity, firms' performance, and firms' dynamics, micro data analysis, private sector and business environment, entrepreneurship, and SMEs, labor market. So without further ado, please, Professor Miloui, please feel free to start your discussion comments. I think you might be muted.
I cannot put my camera. I don't know why. Do you hear me?
We hear you.
Yes, we hear you very well. Mm-hmm.
I cannot put my camera. I don't know why. Yeah.
It's okay. Please feel free to start without the camera.
Yes, no problem. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mona. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased to participate and to share my comments in this session, a very interesting session. Before starting, I would also congratulate the authors for this very good quality of their papers. I would also thank ERF and EFG for this initiative. Quickly, I will start by the first paper by Dr. Zuhair and Dr. Muad. And just to remind you the main question of this paper, this paper aims to explore how SMEs in the MENA region have been affected by the pandemic and how they adapted to this crisis. In the same paper, the authors suggested a list of results, very interesting results, including the fact that larger firms are more resilient than the smallest one. Accommodation, tourism sector is the worst affected in most outcomes. The fact that participation in government assistance programs does not improve firm outcomes. In sum, these are the main results, and these are very expected results. They are not surprising, but they are very interesting because it is important to derive these results from scientific and rigorous methodology. That's what the authors did successfully. And their results confirm our beliefs on the impact of the pandemic. The authors use an estimation of difference in difference equation to assess the effects of the pandemic on firms, on some firms' outcomes as employment, investment, etc. And they take into account different aspects of heterogeneity, as countries' heterogeneity, industries, size, etc. In sum and overall, this is a very nice work. Using a deep data analysis, they use a descriptive, an econometric model to estimate the impact of pandemic on the different outcomes. And they use a very well designed methodology. Just some comments on this paper. I think that in this paper we don't have micro enterprises. The paper doesn't cover the micro enterprises with less than 6 workers, which, as you know, represent a majority in our countries, in MENA region, and which are the most fragile and those that have been most affected by the pandemic. So I don't know why do you exclude the micro firms. I think that the survey cover micro enterprises with less than 6 jobs. My second question is about the list of difficulties, constraints faced by SMEs during the pandemic. You present a list of difficulties, the main difficulties faced by SMEs. But I think that there is a problem which is, in my point of view, very important, which is lacking from this list, which is the problem of liquidity and cash flow after the period of lockdown. As you know, the enterprises were out of production and they don't had sales, and they were not able to finance their operating cycle, including salaries. As you know, in our country, at least in Tunisia, the financing of the operating cycle are very scarce. Because they are very risky, they are not as investment financing. And during the pandemic, the different measures taken by our government were incomplete. Indeed, our government didn't provide a good instrument to finance the operating cycles, and it was a big problem for the enterprises to continue their activities and to pay salaries and to finance their operating cycle. But in your list, in the list presented in this paper, there is, I don't see this problematic or this problem. After that, you present a list of proposals in the end of the paper. And one of your proposal or your recommendations is that we have to be more attentionate and to give a special attention to improve the resilience of the micro firms, the smallest firms. But you don't say how. I think that in your comments, in your proposals, you should and you could go further in the details and propose more specific and feasible actions. I think that you present a very general recommendations which lack details and depth. Another proposal you present in your paper is that the best assistant, you say that the best assistance program would be direct wage subsidies. And here I think that this statement lacks some scientific arguments, as you don't test the impact of the different programs separately. So you can't say that in absolute term, the best assistance program is the wage subsidized, because it depends on many things, as the countries, as the industry, etc. So I think that the main problems related to the assistance programs in our countries are beyond communication and the nature of a program. As you know, our countries offered the same, almost the same programs as other countries, as developed countries. As postponement of bank credits, postponement of tax payment, wage subsidies. So the sorry, the package is almost the same in our countries and in developed countries. But what is the difference? The difference is in terms of the efficiency of these programs in the different contexts, developed and developing countries. I think, in my point of view, two points are important to cite to explain this ineffectiveness of the assistance programs in MENA countries. The first one, which is, in my point of view, very important, is about the amount and the budget dedicated to this program. As you know, this amount was too small if we compare it to the magnitude of the damage, and if compared to the amount raised in other countries, especially in Eurozone and the United States. I would like to share with you this graph, which presents the national financial package in % of GDP in a sample of countries, developed and developing countries. MENA countries are there. And you can see from this graph that the government of rich countries unveil huge financial packages to save their economies. But developing countries are drowning in debt and limited financial resources, so they mobilized very few resources to face the pandemic. You can see, for example, the example of Tunisia and Egypt. The amount mobilized represented 1.8% of GDP. As for France and Germany, it was around 5%, and it is bigger in United States, Canada, and so on. So I think that this was a big problem. The second problem, which explains the ineffectiveness of these programs, is a problem of bad governance of these programs, and especially the problem of implementation. Especially in our country, in Tunisia, we had a lot of problems in terms of delays of implementation, cumbersome procedures, errors in targeting beneficiaries, unsuitable aid distribution channels. And all these problems are related to our structural problems regarding the administrative burden, rigid regulation, our digital gap, the fact that we lack mobile payment, and so on. So all this leads many firms to decide to not participate to these programs. As you mentioned in your paper, the percent of firms which don't participate is so high. I think that for this paper, that's it. I can stop here. For the second one, the second paper by Dr. Senia, this is also a very nice paper. Quickly, the main problematic is, I would say, similar. So the paper discusses the impact of the pandemic on the status of households and firms. And in this paper, we present the case of Sudan. This paper uses very rich data on households and firms. Unlike the first paper, in this paper we have in the sample of firms, the sample include micro firms. And this is very interesting because the author note the differences between micro firms and SMEs in terms of challenges, the impacts of pandemics. There is differences of impacts and different needs for micro and SMEs. And here I would suggest to the author to resume and present more in depth the main differences between micro and SMEs. Differences in terms of impact, main difficulties for each. I think that you don't focus a lot on this, and this is important to resume. You also present some results which are also expected, as the loss of jobs for the majority of households, substantial decrease in sales or stagnation in sales for firms, etc. But you also focus on a very interesting result, which is the limited provision of social protection, and the importance of you propose that the government supports social protection for workers in Sudan. I think that you need to go more in depth on this point. This is my question is to start, in what extent and how this was aggravated by the pandemic. This is mainly the outcome of a high proportion of informality, which was there before the pandemic. The proportion of informality was very high before the pandemic, and I think that it is important to explain that this result, the limited provision of social protection, is resulting maybe mainly from an increased informality rate resulting from the pandemic. As you know, the firms exit and layoffs, limited formal jobs, and increased informal jobs, and so limited provision of social protection. So you don't link this result to informality. You present some results on informality. After that, you present these result in terms of social protection and the limited provision of social protection, but you don't link the two. This is certainly linked to the high rate of informality, to the increase of informality rate after the pandemic crisis. Overall, I think that this is a very good work, but it remains descriptive and comparative paper. I think that what is lacking in this paper is some modelization and inferential analysis, which could give more robustness to your work. And to end, I have just a question which is not easy, and this is true for the first paper also. The problem here is how to isolate the impact of the pandemic from the impact of the economic crisis in Sudan or in our MENA countries. As you know, the economic crisis was already there before the pandemic, and in total, we have the association of the two, and this led to a very complicated and difficult economic and social situation. So how to disentangle the impact of COVID crisis from the whole package of crisis, COVID plus political, plus economical, plus social crisis? That's the main question. I think that I can stop here. Again, thank you to all the authors and the panelists. Maybe we will try to have some answers to my questions, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Milawi, for very comprehensive and insightful comments. I think we have very little time left if you want to be timely for the next session. Already, unfortunately, our first presenter is not here, but he received at least one question on the questions and answer and answered it. I had a very quick comment or question, and for his paper actually, but it is about the Tunisian case. So maybe Professor Reem can venture an answer. I agree with you that many of the results of the two papers were actually to be expected and conventional, but now we have evidence to support them. However, I had a question about the result, which, from a comparative aspect, I think it was a bit surprising that Tunisian and Moroccan firms were less likely to close their business in both waves than Jordanian, that's from the first paper, than Jordanian and Egyptian firms. This is a bit surprising, given that the closure measures, which were much stronger in Tunisia and Morocco than Egypt, for example, and one would have expected a stronger impact on firm closures. And it actually reflected in total GDP growth. So, do you find, Professor Reem, this, my question, is this to be expected, and what specific measures were taken that have prevented the worst outcome during COVID, and maybe something about structural characteristics and the type of government support to SMEs in Tunisia? I also have a quick question to Professor Sati on the Sudanese case. Again, unlike the fact that most of the adjustments in enterprises in the first paper were seen to be in terms of hours of work and wages, as opposed to quantity or reduction in employment, it seems, and of course, the first paper did not consider the case of Sudan, but you have luckily analyzed the Sudanese data, the enterprise data, and you have recorded a big adjustment also in unemployment in many sectors, including manufacturing. And again, I would like your thoughts about why firms had to resort to quantity adjustments, and whether the type of social protection you are proposing can cater for protection of jobs as opposed to incomes, as in many other countries, they have been trying to implement some protection of income with increasing conditional cash transfers, etc. These are my questions, and I'm looking at whether there are any additional questions. Ramaj, are there other additional questions to either papers that we should take account of, or shall I open the floor for anyone who wants to, please pose their question in person?
Dr. Mona, I was also surprised by the results on firm closure in Tunisia. The impact seems to be not very high on firms' exit, but I am surprised because I know that a lot of the number of exit was very high, especially in 2020 and the early 2021. So I don't know if the author could explain more this point.
Sure, but it's not consistent with your expectation. That's what I wanted to.
Yes, but it is just an expectation. I don't do an analysis in depth of this,
sure.
This question. Yes.
Do we have any? Thank you very much. Do you have any? Do we have any other questions from the floor to either authors, preferably to Professor Sati, who's still here with us? Ramaj, do you see any?
No raised hands.
Okay. Or questions? All right. And in that case, I just want to give the floor back to Professor Sati if she wants to respond to my brief question or the points raised by the Professor Reem.
Okay, thanks very much for your comment and for your question. Regarding the comment given by Rima, thank you very much for her comment. And regarding her comment that it is better to make the analysis for micro small enterprises and to make separation or to make the analysis according to the number of size of firm. I actually tried this, but for some questions the response rate is very small. So for some question, some firm didn't give any answer, and all the analysis depend on the response rate from firm and establishment. So for some result, I see that it is not very reliable to make analysis using this methodology. So for this reason, I make the aggregate analysis for all firm using all firm together. But I hope that more data would be available to enable me to revise the result in the future. If the World Bank do another analysis, because I for the micro small establishment and for the firm, I usually I actually use the World Bank data, because the Economic Research Forum data cover very specific question for business enterprises, for household. So due to that limitation, it is very difficult to make separation and analysis according to small and medium small enterprises. And regarding the second comment, for the separation of or making the analysis, which is the impact of COVID and which is the impact of the economic crisis, I think there is interaction between both the current political and economic crisis in Sudan and the impact of COVID. So for this reason, it's very hard to make separation. And as a comment has been given that this is maybe applied to all MENA country. So this is just an attempt to explain how the status of household and firm has changed during the COVID pandemic. So this is just an attempt. But because of data limitation also, it is very hard to make separation between the impact of the current economic and political crisis in Sudan and the impact of COVID. Regarding the comment of Dr. Mona, thank you very much. I agree with you that some sectors have been affected more. For example, manufacturing sector and agriculture sector has been affected more. And I also explain that this is also due to COVID and due to also the current economic and political crisis, and other factors have affected the employment and unemployment in this sector. Also, your comment that women have suffered more than men. In the conclusion, maybe I can also add recommendations that more support should be given to women. For example, working on home have made more burden on women, and also women suffer more from informal sector, working informal sector, and also suffer from less social insurance provided to women. So maybe in the recommendation, we can also recommend supporting women in terms of supporting the sustainable development that suggests supporting of women and empowerment of women. I can add this recommendation in the recommendation section. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Samia. Thank you for all the presenters and for the discussants and the participants, and of course for Shireen and Ramash for excellent organization of the webinar as per the usual. Thank you very much, and I think we can move to the next session if everyone is ready.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Dr. Mona,
Supervisor.
very much. Thank you, Dr. Samia. Thank you, very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Reem. I think we've got Dr. Hafsi with us and Dr. Taib Hafsi, and the floor is yours to start the following session.
Thank you, Ramaj and Shireen. I'm Taib Hafsi. I am professor at HEC Montreal, the business school of the University of Montreal, and I'm happy to welcome all of you to the this session 4 of this great gathering of that's ERF gathering that's devoted to understanding the impact of COVID-19 on firms and households in the MENA region. So we are a little bit tight on time. We're working against a very tight schedule. So without further ado, we're going to move on. We have 2 presentations like we did in session 3. The first presentation, or the first paper, if you will, has been written by Mundir Al-Assasi and Idris Lahna, and the second paper by Irene Claviu, Anna Spinardi, Kevin Hankins, and Nigora Isa Mitinova. And we have a commentator, Caroline Kraft, from St. Catherine's University in St. Paul, Minnesota. So let me start with the first presentation, which is going to be handled by Lahna Idris. So a few words about Lahna. Dr. Lahna is currently a permanent researcher at the Research Center in Applied Economics for Development, CRIAD in Algiers. CRIAD is one of the largest and most significant economic think tanks in Algeria. She received a PhD in Applied Mathematics at Béjaïa University in 2018. Béjaïa, for those of you who don't know, is east of Algiers. Lahna does research in applied mathematics, transportation engineering, computing in mathematics, game theory, and meta-heuristics. So we're going to start with that. I'll make the presentations of the other presenters later. And for the time being, I'm going back to Lahna. Lahna, you ready for going on?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. First of all, we would like to address our thanks to the ERF for the bringing data and for the management of the project. Also, address our gratefulness to the reviewer who gave very helpful remarks that led to the improvement of the paper. So I will present the main results of our study entitled Population's Behavior Analysis Toward COVID-19 Safety Measures, Evidence from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. So after the presentation of the short introduction and the methods and data, we will essentially see the used safety measures to prevent COVID-19 in the aforementioned countries and the intensity of their use, including evolution over time and socioeconomic determinants. Finally, we will give some policy implication. So the management of the COVID-19 pandemic was very challenging. Indeed, at the beginning, the lack of epidemiological knowledge led to some divergence among the researchers concerning the treatment. Almost 1 year after the emergence of the new virus causing the COVID-19 pandemic, the management still challenging, even with the arrival of the vaccine. Indeed, the new variants of the virus make the management very difficult. For all this reason, the use of non-pharmaceutical means and what we call safety measures are the most efficient means to retain the spread of the virus. The safety measures include the washing hands, wearing masks, and social distancing. In this work, we deal essentially with these 3 questions. How do these populations behave regarding the safety measures used? How do these behaviors evolve over time?
and which socioeconomic variables are determinant in these behaviors. To answer this question, we use data provided by the ERF for both Tunisia and Morocco, and we use data provided by the CRIAD for Algeria. We have three waves of data collection for Tunisia and Morocco. The first one is in November 2020, the second in February 2021, and the third one in April 2021. For the case of Algeria, we performed the survey only once, but the question concerning the safety measure were asked within 3 periods. First one is from March 2020 to June 2020. The second period from July 2020 to September 2020. And the last one from October 2020 to May 2021. As we can see here, the 3 waves of data collection of the ERF are embedded in the third period of data collection in Algeria. So it's very difficult to make a comparison between these countries period to period. In order to answer the first question, we divided the study in 2 cases. The first one is the focus is made on the used safety measure kinds. And the second case, we see the intensity of use of safety measures. That's to say, instead of looking the kind of the safety measure, we look the number of used safety measures. In the first case, we perform descriptive analysis and statistical test for each period of time and for each safety measure with the variable gender, age, residence region, and educational level. In the second case, consider a variable xig, which equal to 1 if the safety measure is observed within the G period of time, 0 otherwise. This is the xig represent if a measure is affected or not. Then we calculate the variable sg, which equals to the sum of the ig. This variable represents the number of measures that are respected. For the second question, we construct transition graphs, 2 types of transition graphs. These graphs are represented by a set of vertices. Each vertex represents a number of used safety measure, and each arc of the graph is weighted by the probability Pig that a person who respected E number safety measure at the last period will respect G safety measure at the coming period. We have 2 graphs because we have 3 periods. So the first graph concerns the passing behavior between the first wave and the second graph concerns the passing behaviors between the second and the third periods. Then, focusing on these transition graphs, we perform simulation to see what will happen if this population keep the same behavior over time. For the last question, we perform an ordered probit model to estimate the variable S. Then we consider the variable MNG, which equal to 1 if SG is greater than 1 and 0 otherwise. In other words, MNG represents if a person respect at least 1 safety measure. Then we use a logic model to estimate it. For the control variables, we use demographic variables, including age, gender, material status, educational level, and residence region, household characteristics, including size, number of children and their sex, and number of children enrolled in school, and working status. For the results, first, we can observe that the percentage of people respecting each safety measure is greater than 80% for both Morocco and Tunisia. However, in Algeria, this percentage fall below 80% from October 2020 to May 2021. We also remark a common decrease in the percentages of the used safety measure kinds. except for the safety measure wearing mask, where an increase is noticed from July 2020 to September 2020. Focusing on variables gender, age, educational level, and residence region, it appears that these effects differ following the country, the safety measure, and the period of time. However, there are some variables for which we notice the same behavior all over the time, and whatever the safety measure. These variables are residence region and educational level in Algeria, in such a way that urban people and those having high educational level are the most respectful. Gender and age in Morocco, in such a way that women and the oldest are the most respectful. And gender in Tunisia, where women are more respectful than men. Also, even in the same country, the most used safety measure is generally not the same all over the time, whatever the variable. However, for the residence region in Algeria, we have urban people mostly use social distancing. And in Morocco, for the variable gender, we have men mostly use the measure wear mask. And for Tunisia, we have men mostly use social distancing, whereas women mostly use measure wear a mask. Now, focusing on the number of used safety measure, we notice that most people observe 3 safety measures all over the 3 waves and for all countries. These percentages are greater than 60%. The highest percentage of people observing 3 safety measures is reached in Morocco. This percentage is greater than 80%. Now, when we have performed the simulation, it appears that if the people keep the same behavior that the one they have between the 2nd and the 3rd wave, we have 80% of Moroccans that will respect 3 safety measures. 59% of Tunisians will respect 3 safety measures, and only 5% of Algerians will keep the use of the 3 safety measures. When using the models, it appears that men use a greater number of safety measures than women. Here we have, when we focus on who observe safety measures, it appears that women mostly respect the safety measures. However, if we focus on the number, it appears that men are those who most respect the number safety measures. Also, the oldest comply with fewer measures compared to the youth, to the youngest. It's the same thing. And formal salaried and unemployed respect more barrier measures compared to self-employed workers. Never married respect more barrier measures compared to ever married. And we notice a common decrease on the number of used safety measures over time in all countries. So here is the policy implication. We must focus the sensitization of rural and people with less than basic to basic educational level in Algeria, men and youth in Morocco, and men in Tunisia. We must remind the importance of combining the safety measures, that to say use more than one, especially for women and oldest in the 3 countries. And the communication strategies must then highlight the potential of the virus to infect youth and men, as well as the fact that people with these categories can also experience complicated COVID-19 form or die. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lahna, for this interesting presentation. Thank you very much. We'll get back to you probably with some questions a little later. But for the time being, we're going to move on to the second paper. So the paper, I remind you, has been written by Irene Clavillo, Anna Spinardi, Kevin Hankins, and Nigora Isamidinova. I understand that Anna Spinardi and Nigora Isamidinova are going to make the presentation for this morning or this afternoon. Just reminding you that if you have questions for the paper that has been presented, please use the Q&A and the chat eventually. And even if we have time later, we'll give you the floor. Okay. So Anna Spinardi, just a few words about our presenters. So Anna Spinardi, let me see, is Brazilian and holds an MS in Global Development from the University of Copenhagen and a BA in International Relations from the PUC São Paulo within the development area. Anna has focused her work and attention on topics related to gender inequality and gender-based violence. She also has experience as gender expert and researcher, having participated in the mental health and gender inequality in the MENA region study, and she worked on the institutional gender assessment of Sinvestar that analyzed the dynamics in the workplace of the center. So that's for Dr. Anna Spinardi. Then Dr. Nigora Isamidinova is Uzbekistani, and her professional experience spanned 5 countries across 4 continents: USA, France, Uzbekistan, Senegal, and Tunisia. She holds a BS in chemical engineering from Drexel University and an MPA in development practice with specialization in advanced economic and policy analysis and management from the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, CIPA. She worked on youth development and financial inclusion in Tunisia, in particular. Dr. Nigora is leading COVID-19 socioeconomic impact assessment and recovery projects in Liberia, South Sudan, Togo, Maldives, and the 7 countries of the Western Sahel. So I don't know who of the 2 is going to start, but you have the floor. And so Dr. Nigora, probably you want to start first, right?
Actually, I'm going to start, Doctor. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Okay.
So yeah, Anna is starting.
Anna is starting, okay.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for the presentation. I would like to also thank the presence of everyone today on the webinar. And before I actually start providing the explanations of our paper, I would also like to thank the entire team of the Economic Research Forum, the AFD, and specifically also Carolyn Kraft and Cecilia Polk for the insightful comments, also Ricardo Fuentes Neva, that helped us to develop and improve the analysis of our paper. So in terms of like the motivation behind our main focus on study the potential associations between COVID-19 related factors affecting the household and the gender and mental health inequalities in the MENA region, it's twofold. So first, because since the onset of the pandemic, we have seen that many studies have sought to understand what are these direct and indirect impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on mental health, which vary between like anxiety disorders, mental distress, post-traumatic stress disorders, and loneliness. And second, because the majority of these studies actually have focused on understanding these impacts in Western societies, and little attention has been paid to the situation in countries in the MENA region, for example. So it is important to highlight also that we are not attempting to make causal claims with this paper, but rather to understand this association between factors affecting the household or these factors impacted by the pandemic within the household and mental health, and particularly from a gender perspective. And that's also because several of these existing papers investigating those impacts have pointed that they are higher, that these impacts, these mental health impacts are higher amongst females. It is also important to highlight that several pre-existing gender inequalities, which also affect the quality of women's mental health, already existed in the MENA region prior to the pandemic, such as the gender gap in employment and wages, traditional cultural norms, which generally place women in extremely vulnerable and unfavorable positions in society, including lack of agency and autonomy over their own decisions. But today, we would like to specifically emphasize the food insecurity aspect. That's because we have seen in other presentations in the webinar, in other papers here, But previous studies have shown that in some countries of the MENA region, women tend to experience food insecurity more actively because they are overrepresented in the informal sector and have less access to resources, networks, and also decision-making power. And also several papers have pointed how this status of food security play a key role in balancing the quality of mental health. So to reinforce our main hypothesis in this study, which is that women's mental health is more impaired precisely because they experience more food insecurity, we sought to build a conceptual framework that shows us why women in general already suffer and experience more impaired mental health. One of the main theories behind the association between gender and equality mental health is called stratification theory, which claims that women experience higher levels of impaired mental health because of gender gaps in access to economic opportunities and resources and power. Other papers in the past have also studied how women experience higher levels of anxiety, depression, and other mood disorders because they often lag behind when it comes to mental health related resources, specifically market employment and control over resources. In the case of this paper, we looked more in depth in the association between traditional gender roles and mental illness, specifically because food insecurity would be embedded into this realm of traditional gender roles. So based in these previous studies, we have seen that traditional female gender roles as housewives and caregivers are predominant in the MENA region and in MENA countries, and therefore they are the main responsible. Women are the main responsible for getting groceries and taking care of the family nutrition. In this sense, they are likely to experience more anxiety and stress over the fluctuation in food prices, disruption in food supply chains, and also access to market and food. So in terms of the methodology, we chose the Oaxaca blinder decomposition model, since this methodology allows for the identification and also to quantify the factors correlated with the difference in mental well-being outcomes. Furthermore, the Oaxaca blinder decomposition model allows us to decompose the gender mental health gap into the explained part, that is the differences in the means of the explanatory variables, and the unexplained part, that is the differences in the returns or impacts of the explanatory variables. In terms of data, we use the Economic Research Forum COVID MENA Monitor Survey Panel dataset. I think this has been explained before, but I would like to highlight again, the baseline wave of this dataset was collected in November 2020 for Morocco and Tunisia, and in February 2021 for Jordan and Egypt, and harmonized by the Economic Research Forum. In this study, we used the two first waves of data, so wave 1 and 2, for the 4 countries available at the onset of the study, so specifically Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, and Jordan. Specifically, the analysis focused on the results for wave 2, since this is the only round for which the key mental well-being variable, that is the WHO 5-scale mental well-being index, was available for the full sample of the 4 countries. In wave 1, the mental well-being variable was only available for Tunisia and Morocco. Also, the decomposition results indicate that the gaps in mental well-being are only statistically significant in the case of Egypt and Morocco. So for this reason, our main analysis is centered around the results for these 2 countries and then for the full sample of the 4 countries captured in wave 2. The explanatory variables that we chose to analyze the association between the factors and the mental health are the food insecurity scale, of course, shifts in labor market status, income decrease, the number of coping strategies, and the baseline labor market status. And in terms of the socioeconomic control variables that we used for the analysis, they are age, urbanity, household size, and child ratio. So now I'm going to pass the word to my colleague Nigora, that's going to present more about the results and also the policy implications. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. So yes, I will take over here to present the results, the key findings of our study. So here, just a very quick snapshot of the descriptive statistics and the main variables that Anna has just explained and went over. So to be noted here, I'm going to go over the key findings in terms of each variable. And just to be noted here is that In addition to the WHO 5 Mental Wellbeing Index, the survey also included the anxiety scale that was measured by the level of worry over COVID-19 and the level of worry over the economic situation. However, those two variables, given that they're highly endogenous to the WHO 5 Mental Wellbeing Index, they were not included as the main variables of interest in the Oaxaca blinder decomposition analysis. So on the next slide, we can see that one of the main, so in terms of the descriptive statistics, what we see is that the hypothesis of the gender gap in mental well-being is confirmed. So we see that there's a difference in the self-reported WHO 5 Mental Well-being Index in the pooled sample, which is on average, I think we can go to the next slide. Anna. Thank you. Which is on average about 2.5 percentage points lower for women, meaning it's worse in the pooled sample of all 4 countries. In Egypt and Morocco, it is the difference is higher, with 4.3 percentage point difference in Egypt and 7.5 percentage point difference in Morocco. So we also see that women report higher anxiety and worry levels over the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic situation during the pandemic as well. But as I mentioned, so we're not covering these two. We didn't include these 2 variables in the Oaxaca blind decomposition levels, given that they are correlated with the mental well-being variable itself. Also, one thing to note here is that the mental health variable is captured at the individual level. So here we see that also in terms of the food security levels, women also report higher food insecurity. As you can see, so in the pooled samples, the difference is modest. It's equivalent to 0.5 percentage points between women respondents and male respondents, and slightly higher in Egypt and Morocco with 0.38 percentage point difference in the perceived food insecurity level. And here, of course, so the food security variable is captured at the household level. But the survey captures the gender of the respondent, and this is so this is how we use this variation in the experiences based on the gender of the respondent and investigate its association to the difference in the reported mental well-being. With regards to the shift in labor market status and income decrease, the differences are statistically significant, but they are low in magnitude. And what is interesting to point out here is that men actually do report more negative shifts, which is likely related to their baseline, so pre-pandemic higher participation in the labor force. I think that we can go to the next slide. Yes, and so here primarily, so this is the results of the Oaxaca blinder decomposition. It is important to also note that we are not claiming causality between the mental health gap between genders and the food insecurity differential, since there may be gender-related selection bias informed response as well. However, what we do see is that 49% of the mental well-being gap is explained or associated with the differences in the means of the included explanatory variables for the pooled sample. In case of Egypt, this explained part is only 23% and 55% in Morocco. And also food insecurity scale, so the reported food insecurity level yields consistent significant coefficients, which means that it's correlating with the gap and consistently correlated with the gap in mental well-being. So the gap between the males and females. The pre-pandemic baseline labor market participation, which is lower for women, the baseline also contributes to this explained part. And shifts in labor market status and decrease in income and number of coping strategies did not yield any significant contribution to this gendered mental well-being based on our results. So one of the explanations for this difference is, as outlined and mentioned by Anna in the beginning, is that women potentially tend to be more involved in the management of the household resources and food availability for the household, given that their labor market participation is lower in the studied countries, and hence the food scarcity. They would be more aware of the food scarcity situation and potentially have less power over the economic situation, and so that would affect their mental health more highly than the mental health of men. So that's the kind of the potential explanation that we see for these findings, which are also consistent with the empirical evidence that shows that the prevalence of disparities in food security, the prevalence of this perceived food insecurity between men and women during the pandemic of COVID-19. And so another important point we wanted to make is that we also acknowledge that there are limitations to the data available through the survey and the analysis of the study. So we advocate for more, we recommend more data collection and evidence that would focus specifically on the issues of mental health in the MENA region, especially given that there are very scarce studies that are done that focus on mental health and that focus also on differential, on the different experiences and different status between men and women in terms of mental health. And also, so basically, yes, a more in-depth exploration of the various determinants of mental health would be needed to understand better what are the contributing factors to the differential experience and what are the driving factors of mental health between genders. In terms of our policy implications, we wanted to so we kind of focus on what I just mentioned. So we think that there's a need for more data and for further research, specifically with a gender lens. So focusing on gender disaggregated data and evidence on mental health outcomes to understand the dynamics and contributing and driving factors. Also, more investment and policy support needs to be given to the mental health and psychosocial services. Specifically also targeting women, given that the study shows that the perceived mental well-being is worse among women than men. So increase and improve psychosocial support services, which could be such services as creation of mental health crisis support hotlines, also combining that with different health services, different campaigns to reduce the stigma of mental health and asking for help around mental health. Additionally, in crisis situations such as the COVID-19 pandemic, so targeted food assistance programs that can alleviate the immediate food insecurity are important, and also the question of healthy and nutritious food, so not just any food assistance, but ensuring that this food assistance is also healthy and nutritious as well. Also, another public policy implication that we see is the kind of mainstreaming and more advocacy for public policies around the care economy that would have a feminist lens and that would aim to reduce the double burden of domestic workload experienced or of workload experienced by women. And also, last but not least, the social safety net programs, so supporting the expansion, better targeting, and better administration of the safety net programs, as has been outlined by previous panelists. A lot of times, certain social safety net programs are there, but their administration and targeting might not be as efficient during crisis settings. Thank you very much for your attention. And yes, again, thanks for all of the moderators, commentators, and especially Professor Kraft and Poggi for their continued support during the study. So we're available for any comments and questions. Also, our Irene Clavijo is also on the line, so that would help to answer the questions. Many thanks.
Thank you, Anna and Nigora. Sorry. We're going to hear from our lead commentator, Caroline Kraft, and then we'll get back to you with questions, hopefully. So just a few words about Caroline. Dr. Caroline Kraft is an associate professor of economics at St. Catherine's University. I mentioned earlier that St. Catherine's, correct me, Caroline, if I'm wrong, St. Catherine's is in St. Paul, Minnesota, right? So she received her master's degree in public policy from the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs and her PhD from the Department of Applied Economics at the University of Minnesota. Research examines issues in development economics, primarily labor, education, health, and inequality in the Middle East and North Africa. So I'm going to stop there and leave the floor to you, Caroline.
Great. Give me just a moment to share my slides here. Okay, hopefully everyone is seeing slides. Yes?
Fine,
okay,
thank
wonderful. You. Wonderful. Okay, so I really am excited to be discussing these two papers today and really to see all the great research that's coming out of this data and this interesting work. Particularly, these papers have a sort of health aspect, so public health behaviors and mental health, which is really an interesting and important dynamic within the pandemic. So I'm going to make an overarching comment about both the papers and really all the papers that have been presented today, just as we think about research going forward and data collection going forward. I think one of the things we see from these papers is the importance of multi-topic, multi-purpose, publicly available data. Likewise with ERF, the labor market panel surveys, which were like in person, are very multi-topic. So we can look at the relationships between different topics, like food security and mental health, for example. And in the same vein, the COVID-19 MENA monitor was designed primarily to be about the labor market, but also topics like mental health and public health behaviors. And an important thing to emphasize is it's a short survey, right? It's a phone survey. We had to keep it at a short length. But to keep in mind that we can cover multiple topics even in short phone surveys and how important this is really to examine those linkages. So something I really want to keep in mind going forward for research and data collection. In terms of the first paper, in terms of the population's behavior towards COVID-19 safety measures, I have just a few comments. First, really, I appreciate the focus. Public health behaviors can potentially improve both lives, health piece, and livelihoods. And I think this is something that's a little underappreciated when we're talking about, well, is there a lives versus livelihoods trade-off a bit yesterday? And sometimes with things like closures, there may be some trade-offs, but for things like hand washing, mask wearing, you can enhance both the health aspect and also prevent those shutdowns and have positive economic effects by reducing like worker productivity losses, health, things like that. So I think it's really worth emphasizing and framing this paper and sort of pitching it for publication that these sort of health behaviors are ones that really improve both the health aspect and the economic aspect potentially. So the paper examines sort of three parts, really the level of these public health behaviors, how that's changed over time, and then who engages in these behaviors. And it has nicely complementing data from the COVID-19 MENA monitor survey and also the Algerian survey, where it's a good point to make sure data has sort of comparable questions and harmonizing. They're slightly different questions, but basically they're looking at social distancing, masks, and either hand washing or hand sanitizing. And really, I think it's important to look at all these aspects, but particularly who undertakes public health behaviors really matters for both health consequences, but also targeting improvements, right? Public health communication. So I think that's something the authors could really sort of sell more as their contribution, is that it's really important to know these sorts of things to think about targeting. Now, in terms of the results, the levels and the trends particularly, the reports of the health behaviors are very high, which in one sense is great, but I'm always a little dubious about when everyone says, oh yes, everyone is masking, right? Everyone. Is this implausibly high? Is there some social desirability bias here, right? Are we getting some measurement issues? So I do think that's an interesting and important one to spend some time thinking about, and how might it affect the results to look at that. So the level may be a little overreported, but I think the trend may be really kind of the informative piece here too, and that's a decrease over time. And a decrease over time, I would point out, that is not necessarily in line with case counts. There's a nice figure that shows like the timing of the waves and the cases in the paper. And so there may be some sort of pandemic fatigue going on here. And that's really an interesting issue from a public health perspective, like what can we do about this? The paper has some very interesting, in terms of the trend, these transition graphs. There's one on the right here. And it's about how many measures folks use in the first period versus the second. So like those numbers are, do you use 0 measures, 1, 2, or 3? And it's the probabilities of transitioning from something to something else. So it adds to 1 from the starting point. So if you start at a particular point, you can see kind of what's going on. And I was very intrigued by these graphs, but in the long-term simulations, they sort of assume convergence and stability at different levels by country, and different levels depending on if you use the first or the second transition. So for those simulations, the trend over time versus the simulations have kind of different implications. And so that's, I think, something the paper may need to try to reconcile those sort of different results, basically using the same data. In terms of who engages in safety measures, there's some interesting differences by country, and it would be great to see comparisons really directly across countries. The results are generally after split by country, so you can pull in text, country wave interactions. The differences that matter are interesting. There's a gender component here as well. Women engage in more safety measures than men in the 2 countries. And also it really varies by country, but they're urban, education, and age group, older ages, more engage in safety measures in 1 of the 3. And some of this aligns with risks, but other aspects, gender do not. So I think that's worth exploring, like what might be driving these things. And really, that's the question I pose for future research for this paper. Interesting question for future research is not just who, but why. Why are some people responding in different ways? And then you can both better target interventions and better design public health interventions. And I do think there's an opportunity here to link to the rich literature on health communication, health promotion in the public health field. I think that would be, particularly if you're publishing this within public health, helpful to see. So it's a very interesting paper, and I enjoyed reading it and look forward to seeing where the authors take it. Moving to the second paper on mental health and gender inequality. I really want to emphasize the importance of tackling this topic. We know mental health is very under-researched in the region, in part due to data limitations. So having more data on this is great. I would make sure to say, like, the WHO-5 scale that's used is more clearly interpreted as subjective well-being, which is also important. You can have low subjective well-being, and the evidence we do have in the region suggests low subjective well-being and gender disparities that motivate this paper. And the paper looks at this association between factors that affected, so changes that happened to households primarily during the pandemic, or difficulties they were facing, and this well-being, this subjective well-being. It focuses on the second wave. There are more waves. If you want to do all 4 countries, you could also do the 4th wave and then look at the evolution, which would be super interesting. I know that might not have been available when you started the paper, but all are available now. And the paper decomposes the mental health gap by gender. So it looks at the explained part, the differences in characteristics and endowments, and the unexplained components, the differences in returns. In this context, not so much returns, but like trade-offs for these characteristics. And this is an interesting approach. I mean, I think it's important to look at the gender gap. I'm not as sure the decomposition does as much as really just looking at determinants of mental health though. In terms of their findings, levels of well-being are low. So this is an important, interesting finding. And I don't think enough is made of this, right? Like less than 50 is low well-being typically. Interestingly, the paper only finds statistically significant gendered mental health gap in 2 of the 4 countries. And I think it's Egypt and Morocco, not Jordan and Tunisia. So why, right? That's a super interesting question. And also, I really wanted to know, how do some of the gender gaps compare to other gaps, such as by education or income levels? Like knowing the size of this gap relative to other gaps would help me be like, is this the most important one to focus on? Or is it the issue primarily poverty in terms of low well-being? The paper really focuses on these changes that potentially could be due to COVID-19, like shifting in labor market status. But again, people do also just leave the labor market, particularly women, in the absence of COVID-19 as well. The strongest results are around food insecurity, And as authors note, there's an association. It's really challenging to say, is this food insecurity or other correlates such as poverty, right? The interpretation of the associations is challenging here, and the authors note that. So I just want to end this with a couple ideas about really the policy implication. The paper has broad policy implications around safety nets, gender domestic work, psychosocial services for women, and I generally agree with these. But as we know in one of the earlier papers too, they're pretty broad. They're not very specific. So I think it could be very helpful for policymakers to really have some more concrete information on things like how available and affordable are these services, and also what works in terms of offering these services. There's a lot of interesting recent evidence, and I'll email this so you have these references, on the importance of psychosocial, economic policies and their combination. So in India, there was just a study that recently came out showing that psychotherapy that costs $66 per person in total reduced depression by 11 percentage points, so like super cost effective. For well-being and economic outcomes, treatment arms adding psychosocial interventions to graduation programs, so these anti-poverty programs targeting the ultra poor, were the most cost-effective version in Niger, right? So this is interesting, adding the psychosocial piece. And then another example is cognitive behavioral therapy, a type of psychosocial intervention, and cash were highly effective together, more so than other options as a crime reduction policy in another study. So I think these specifics would be very helpful in providing some examples, like how can you do this? How can you scale it up in a country? Would be very interesting. So thank you for these very interesting papers, and really appreciate all the work the authors put into thinking about these issues.
Thank you, Caroline. So now we can spend a few minutes, I suppose, giving you the chance, at least the presenters, to react to Caroline's comments. I have seen that for the first paper, also Munde Asasi is present, and in addition to Lahna. So please, would you want to react to what has been said before? Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can hear you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I want to thank Caroline and Cecilia for all comments. Torag said they sent us some comments before. So I think we have two questions about first why. So in Algeria, in the city of Algeria, we ask many questions to have this information about why people respect or not the healthily the barrier measure. So we have a lot of indicators, but and also in Algeria we ask information. We ask question about the communication, the impact of communication, the type of communication. Through TV, through newspaper, through WhatsApp, Facebook, or other. But we don't have this information in the case of Tunisia and Morocco. So we can try to do this estimation and introduce these indicators in the case of Algeria, but not in the case of Tunisia and Morocco and Sudan and Jordania. We do a lot of estimation, different specification also for Sudan, for Jordania, don't put this in the paper. The second question about the pool, yes, we can do this, pull the data and use the dummy variable of country and interaction with the waves. So
perhaps a brief question also
yes.
that is not directly related to your results, but have you been interested in the relationship between behavior and outcomes? I mean, outcomes in terms of what happened in terms of mortality and so on and so forth in both Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia.
Yes, this question is very interesting, and we try to see the relation, but up to now we couldn't have really conclusion.
Okay, fine, but that's a question, of course, you're addressing, right? Okay, fair enough. Now I see for the second paper, Irene Clavier, who is part of the group now, and so maybe I don't know, Nigora, Anna, and Irene, you may want to react to the comments by Caroline.
If you want, I can start out. Can everyone hear me correctly?
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
So thank you very much, Professor Kraft and Professor Poggi, for all the comments. We must say that this final version is quite different from the first one. So we benefited from the comments that we received midway. Thank you very much. For one, as Nigora mentioned, in the initial paper, we had included these variables that had to do with anxiety. And then as pointed out by one of the commenters, that was probably driving way too high the explained part of the paper. So we were, it was a comment that we integrated into the paper, and taking out these variables, they're useful in the sense of the descriptives and moving in the same direction as the subjective well-being variable itself. But lo and behold, it did drive down the explained part of the proportion that was explained. So that made it more realistic. Regarding the comments, for one, yes, all the waves are now have consistently the variables. So it would be quite a contribution to be able to expand it to the other waves, and especially as Professor Kraft mentions, maybe seeing some evolution so that we have a better sense of, is this related to COVID-19, or is it, just really a static movement that we were finding with regards to the labor market that has all sorts of shifts or movements in terms of poverty. So for sure, expanding to the other waves would give that time dimension, which I think would be quite beneficial. On the comment about the WHO measure being more so, subjective well-being and not maybe clinical depression, I think that a point well taken, and especially when we talk about recommendations, I think it would be a more accurate nomer to be saying social well-being rather than mental health in the broad sense. Point well taken also about the recommendations being too broad. I find very interesting these references that about Chris Blattman's work. I know his work from before in cognitive therapy. So I find it very interesting, and especially what you say about in conjunction with something else, it being more having more of an impact than kind of the two separate on their own, and probably that makes it more cost effective. So I think that digging in, seeing whether some of these policies have been put in place in the countries, specifically focusing on this type of interventions, which we hadn't focused on before because we didn't know about them. Would be I think an improvement in seeing whether some of this has been tried out in the countries for which we have the results. So thank you very much about the comment about the existing policies. I find that very interesting, and I will leave it there.
Yeah. I don't know, Nigora, Anna, would you like to add a few words, if necessary, right?
No, thank you very much. I think.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Shireen, Ramaj, any pressing questions on the chat or Q&A?
I can't see anything in the Q&A or chat. Okay. So we can thank our speakers and your kind self and our lead commentator, and move to our closing session.
Okay, very good. Okay, well, great thanks to all of you for this really interesting work. I hope that we're going to keep working on it. There's still a lot to learn about COVID-19 and its effect on societies and people and firms, of course. Thank you very much. And so I leave the floor to you for the closing.
We have one hand raised.
Just can you please send us the comment if Caroline can?
Oh yes, I'll email it to you. I'll email it to you after my next meetings.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
To both the authors.
Thank you.
Dr. Mahmoud?
Good afternoon, good day to everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, good afternoon and good day to you too.
Thank you very much, you guys. I would like to welcome, this is our last probably few minutes to discuss the entire outcome of all our presentation. Therefore, I would like to thank our attendees, our presenters, would like to the commentators, and finally, I would like to thank the ERF family for its hard work in putting all these efforts to make us come and be enlightened about the impact of COVID-19 on labor, wages, rent, etc. That all very enlightening and illuminating. Our final presentation today, or our final comment today by three distinguished professors that we have over here, which is what are the lessons we learned from the crisis and how can we do better? Hopefully, we will be able to learn and improve and forecast, or at least stipulate, or from this to come up with a better future for everyone. I would like to make one comment before I go to the distinguished presenters, and that is based on, since we're going to do how can we do better, how are we going to look at the debt market, equity market downturn, which is not normal. Both equity market, debt market are going down, inflation is going up. That is due to the COVID, in addition to the Ukrainian war. Looking forward, how is that going to affect labor, and how is that going to affect the wages and the rent? And I think I'll leave that to the economist and commentator to tell me that. But we have three distinguished professors over here I would like to introduce to you, and then I'll give the floor to our presenters. We have Cecilia Pugi, is a labor economist and research officer for the social protection at the AFD Research Department. She is conducting research on social protection, the world of work, informality, and social inclusion. That will be social inclusion in economic. Dr. Cecilia holds a PhD in economics from the University of Sussex, and that is a British word, probably Sussex. That will be in United Kingdom. We have another, doesn't need to be a lot of introduction, Dr. Raji Asad. I mean, it's well known to everybody, especially in this field. A good friend and colleague, is a professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs in the University of Minnesota, and that is in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he co-chaired the Master of Development Practice Program. He has been an ERF Research Fellow since '94 and served as a member of its Board of Trustees. He is also a member of the Board of Trustees of the Arab Council for the Social Sciences. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center of Labor Economics in Bonn, Germany. Dr. Asad current research focus on the labor markets in the Arab world, with a focus on youth and gender issues as they relate to education, transitioning from school to work, employment and unemployment, informality, migration, and family formation. Dr. Asad is one of the leads researcher in this field. We also have another distinguished professor, Dr. Muhammad Ali Mourani, is a resident representative of the Institute of Research.
I don't know who your teacher is.
is a resident representative of the Institute of Research for Development in Tunisia and Associate Professor of Economics at Paris Pantheon-Sorbonne University. He is a research fellow of the Economic Research Forum, member of the advisory group of the African Evidence Network, research fellow of the Migration Institute, and research associate of the LEDA-DIAL Paris Dauphine University. His research focus on the interaction between structural change, skills demand, and productivity growth, and on the impact of migration on the MENA region. He is currently a co-principal investigator of various research initiatives on the impact of COVID-19 and particularly on the vulnerability of firms to social distancing measures. I would like to welcome our panelists. I would like to welcome our attendees. Again, the floor is to start with Dr. Cecilia. We'll probably go for about 8 minutes each, and then we'll leave 4 or 5 minutes for anybody who have a question, comments, or concern. Once again, I do thank you. The floor is yours, Dr. Cecilia.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to thank again ERF and all of the colleagues of the network for this fantastic collaboration that we had together. So, well, I'm gonna give you my few cents coming from the point of view of a researcher that is in the research department of a development agency. So I would like to share perhaps 2 relevant aspects that I believe that are worth emphasizing in thinking what can we do better in a post-COVID world, where, as Dr. Mahmoud was actually noticing, we are already facing new challenges ahead that are in front of us, if not already on us. So, well, the first point that I find relevant and that this partnership has brought evidence for development agency perspective is that the availability and use of timely data about households and firms is really primordial for policy dialogue. That so if we look at the dimension of the households or the micro world and we ask the question of what the COVID-19 crisis has been doing to households, enterprises, but even individuals in general, what we can understand is that the richness of the research produced today can really inform us on many levels on how resilience and adaptation do manifest themselves across the region. So one anecdote that is interesting to share is that as the MENA monitor data waves were released, within AFD, we actually appreciated a lot being able to discuss both with the authors as well as among ourselves on how could we compare these figures with both national level data available as well as the global trends. And for those of you who have not done it yet, do consult the ERF policy briefs for these data sets because they are extremely rich in the type of snapshots that they can give you over the course of what has happened in the last year or so. So an updated the statistics national level imperative to inform policy, I believe, in the aftermath of a COVID-19 crisis. There is also those questions that are generally unanswered or less known that are most important to have next to us in the aftermath of the COVID-19. And for instance, some of the studies that were presented today and yesterday look at instruments that generally are not found in national statistics. For instance, the perception of households when we look at employment outcomes or about firm needs as presented today in the studies for MNEs as well as for the case of Sudan. And we notice that the more an economic situation becomes complex and where there are multiple knock-on effects that are brought about, the more development practitioners should really rely as much as possible on the use of data for accompany their dialogues on how to best answer. And the second cent that I can bring on the table for the aftermath of this COVID-19 crisis is how to best plan for the future ahead. So, for instance, today we just seen the presentation on how, within respect of a global health response, there are some results that can tell us about how safety measures have been used, and how this can bring suggestions of the existing awareness challenges that are experienced across country in the MENA region and beyond, and therefore informal public health policy, as also Caroline mentioned earlier in her comments. And the research presented brings also some light on issues that should investigate it further. And if we think of the last presentation about the role of subjective well-being and mental health, we can think that really there is a huge evidence gap, as well as also instrument analysis on how both mental health provision and social service provision are available in the region. And as a last thought, mostly again coming from a social perspective, I'm sure that Raghi and Mohammed Ali will bring other angles to the table. But I wanted to stress that as actors from development agency perspective, we do really appreciate the proposition of evidence to inform us about the instruments that should be best addressed in the aftermath of a crisis. And for instance, yesterday we discussed with one social assistant paper on how does different instruments should be used and whether countries should change or not their behavior towards the use of instruments. And I believe that it is relevant to take stock of this existing evidence because they can help to understand how innovative solutions have been deployed in the region, because there are some very positive aspects actually we could talk about, but also of course as those shortcomings that need to be filled in the future. So I leave it here and I pass the floor to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cecilia. I'll give the floor to Dr. Asad.
Okay, I might be cut off because I'm having trouble with my equipment. So if I am, please let Dr. Marwani speak and then I will try to come back in. But anyway, in the meantime, let me, so I want to basically comment on three things. The first is the issue of attribution of causal effect. We know that crises are shocks that are affect economies that are also being affected by multiple other shocks. And the case of Sudan is a case in point. We know that Sudan was going through a very hard time prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic. And the COVID just added another layer of problem. And so while we may not be able to disentangle the effects of the pandemic versus the effects of the crises that the country is going on, we should be very careful in the way we speak about the pandemic. So rather than saying this is the effect of the pandemic on households, we should say this has been the experience of individuals and firms and households through the pandemic. And the other things that are going on within the economy. And I think in particular,
I think Dr. Asad, we lost him. Raghi, can you hear me, you guys? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Doctor, I think we lost Dr. Asad. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Mourani. Please go ahead, take the floor, and we'll see what happens. Hopefully he'll be joining us again.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to start by reflecting a little bit on the whole process of this project. And I think it's really interesting because it started in March 2020. So the first days of COVID, 2 or 3 researchers and the ERF staff, we started thinking about it, and then we went to donors, and most of them were very kind to collaborate with us. But I like this way of doing it. It's really bottom up, because what happens often is that donors have projects and then they look for consultants, researchers. So this time it started from the network, and really this shows the role of ERF, the unique role of ERF as a link between research, donor community, policymakers. I really like this way. I mean, ERF works a lot like this, but this time it was really important. We were just thinking, what can we do as citizens and economists to contribute to this crisis? We are not doctors, but we can do something. And it was clearly first start, find data and then do analysis, because the data was not completely available. There were some experiences at the World Bank. So World Bank did some, and then it stopped at some point, and our surveys started just right after the World Bank. So our data became kind of the reference data in the region. And this is really something I think we are all, all the team here is proud of. So I think it's, and it even maybe changed the relationship between, I'm talking a lot with many colleagues from the World Bank, and I feel they want us to do research together much more today. So I think we have so many crises, we have so many problems that it's time to work more together, because usually everyone was doing his own research and then talking. And I think this gathering is very important in terms of way of doing things. The second point I wanted to talk about is the issues. So what are the main issues? We found some of them we already knew, but we found them really so important here. Is the first is the issue of informality. So all the work we did, we found that micro firms, informal ones, were much more having problems with the crisis. The same informal workers were the most affected. These people were not able to get any help from the governments. So not always the poorest people, but the people who are not identified. And so informality is really an issue that we need to work on, and we need to find solutions about informality. And the other is the effectiveness of policies. So countries in the region are having more and more problems of resources, and with the debt crisis that's probably coming everywhere in the developing world, we'll have even more problems of this kind. So targeting, finding effective policies, targeting while taking into account, of course, political economy, because targeting doesn't work all the time. So we will have, I think we need to kind of start thinking about a new discipline called the economics of crisis, because crisis with climate change, with these wars, with all these problems, I think it's becoming more and more often. And we need to think not business as usual, but we need to think as things happen. This is what we did this time. The crisis was going on and people were doing analytical work. And I think really it's maybe the first time in history, at least this is the first time I saw something like this. And the third point, and which is not easy also, it seems obvious, but it's not, is the bridges with the government, with civil society, because we were producing data, producing policy briefs, inviting people but it doesn't necessarily trickle down in government action sometimes, for many reasons, because governments are not aware. Awareness, I don't know, because I think we distributed a lot, but maybe they were not ready, they were not caring about this, they were just trying to find money quickly, thinking about other. So how to create more links with the Institutes of Statistics, and it's not always easy, and with the governments. So have these three categories: donors, governments, large sense, and the research community working together in such periods seems to, in such period and in others, but especially in such periods, seems to be really, really worth investing in the process. And thank you.
Okay. Any other comment from the audience, from presenters? Dr. Cecilia, I'm sorry that Dr. Asad is not joining us yet. Anybody else would like to say something?
Yes, if you allow me, I'd like to say a few words here.
Please do.
We have what we have seen in the COVID-19 is the very strong influence of doctors, health professionals, and so on, and the very weak influence of economists. That means economics has been out of the way, and we've seen governments, for example, making huge decisions. I'm talking really about the onset of the COVID-19. Huge decisions about the confinement with amazing costs. The figures that come out, for example, for how much the US has been spending to deal with that early confinement is just staggering. $16 trillion, something of that sort. Okay, so my question to you is, should we be interested in whether we overreacted to COVID-19 or not?
Opening the question to
everybody.
Okay. You guys, I'll give you the floor first, and I'll have my own comment. But I would like to give you the floor first, since you guys, the researcher on this neighborhood. Anybody? Dr. Mourani, Dr. Cecilia?
Yeah, what I think we didn't talk about the next steps, but if we want to pursue this work, I think even with just the data we have, I think one of the two interesting aspects. One could be to look at the medium-term, long-term effects of this crisis, but maybe not exactly with these data. The other part is more with this data is compare the different countries didn't have the same policies. In terms of closure, but also in terms of accompanying. For example, Jordan put much more money than the other countries. And so it would be interesting to see also if this was effective. If this was effective, if it had an impact on, I don't know, economic growth, on sectors recovery, on if the countries that put more money did better in terms of economic recovery, for example. So this is something. For the other question, to respond exactly to Dr. Tayyip Hafsi's question, it's very difficult to look at did we overreact or not. But there also, I think comparing countries can be, because countries didn't have the same policies in the same periods. And the problem is that also there is an impact of what you did last year on your outcomes this year. And in another paper that we didn't present, that will be presented later in another event, we talk about volatility also, and how the volatility of the decisions can matter, not just the stringency of the decisions. So it's quite complex. It's difficult to talk about it today. I mean, but maybe after a few years we can compare what happened and have a better view.
Dr. Cecilia, any comment?
Yeah, just like to complement by saying on this question, have we overreacted? As a reality of matters in many, let's say, among practitioners circles, one of the realizations was that, yes, it's true that different actors and different expertise were taken seriously and well into account in a timely manner to set up policies, that this is a real difference with respect to other forms of covariate shocks or crises that were experienced in the last 15 to 20 years. And I take, for instance, the example of the financial crisis to that respect. But what has been interesting has been the multi-level actors coordination that has been taking place. And as Mohammed Ali just now said, we tend to have now a very short-term window that we can analyze. So maybe my comment is not going to be fully correct in a few years' time. But what has been very interesting is that the level of coordination within different area of government, within countries, as well as across different international and national institutions, has never been seen before, being so actively engaged in other different areas. So if it is true that there may have been some worse than desired uses for resources, the reality is that the mobilization of these resources and for final means has been extremely exceptional in a short amount of time. So even if I don't want, of course, to justify full all of government, what I say is just that it would be very interesting for the future to see what have been the best practices that could be replicated in other contexts or for future health crisis experienced.
Thank you, guys. I would like to have my 5-cent input in this, in sense that government interference in 2008 financial crisis and in the 2019 COVID and thereafter, government interference was fast and furious. They did not wait for economists to get their opinion and what is the best solution. I think the administration, which is they implemented and give all this money, therefore they implemented this fiscal money, which is I call the helicopter money. They start giving money to the society. In the first place in 2008, unfortunately, they give it to corporation, they left individuals. In the second cases, they give it to both individuals and corporations. And therefore, yes, in both cases, the government overreacted or at least to expedite the process or to mitigate probably the impact of the two crises, they reacted without listening to a lot of economists in this long-term consequences. I think in the current one is we seeing valuing the debt market, down valuing the equity market. At the same time, inflation, which is I call the triple-digit risk. At the same time, in all of us, and mainly when we talk about the gap between the have and the have not, especially when we talk about the gap, it has increased really, and it's going to be a higher increase due to the inflation and due to the downturn in most of these people who have saved money, nor can be able to save at a higher rate to retire or to live a better life. I think, yes, government overreacted, but we never know if they would have stayed without any policy, how would that be the impact, because it's already been done. Okay, and that's my 5 cents of what I think, learning from 2008 and 2019, hopefully we will learn further. Any other question, comments, concerns, additives, preservatives? Anybody? I think, unfortunately, that we're missing Dr. Asad comment, which is I was looking forward to his conclusion about the entire scene. You guys have been contributed a lot. If we have no further questions, comment, or concerns, I would like to yield to Shireen and see if Shireen have anything. And before I yield, I would like to again to thank the ERF and to all the presenters and to all the ERF, what I call the family of the ERF, the presenters, commentators, and all of that, and the family, the management, for giving us the opportunity to discuss and bring our opinion to the open. Thank you very much. Shireen, I yield the floor to you.
Dr. Mahmoud, I just want to echo your thanks to our speakers, commentators, moderators, and the family of the project and our partners, and also the ERF management, and to you particularly for an excellent closing of a very rich 2-day discussion. Thank you all, and all the proceedings, all the material, presentation and recording will be made available online should you wish to use it for reference. Thanks to all and have a great evening.
Thank you.